Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Superficial Spirit. Got a good one for you today. Our guest today is a registered clinical counselor at Thrive downtown Vancouver, which is a counseling center that offers, amongst other things, psychedelic integration. Colter has been sober for more than a decade and is passionate about the healing properties and potential of psychedelics. Colter, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
We've known each other for a while, and we recently connected at a mutual friend's. What was it? Engagement party. It was
Engagement
engagement
party.
party, right?
Yeah.
Engagement party. Thank you. I'm so happy to see you there, by the way, because I never know with like, I hate to say it, straight people engagement things or wedding things. I'm always like, is there going to be other gays? I just moved back to Vancouver, and I was so happy to see you and Trevor there. I was like, yay! It was so nice.
It was a nice free connection.
And then we obviously quickly started talking about I wasn't drinking, you weren't drinking, Trevor wasn't drinking, Evan wasn't drinking, so recovery came up obviously. And it's always interesting because when you go back, I mean, we're at the age now where mid 30s, mid 30s, late 30s, early 40s. Like if you were a party kid in your 20, at around this time is like when people either get their shit together or they really go down maybe a not easy path.
I
You
would
know,
say
like
around at 25, 27 tends to be it really does tend to be a marker. It's that Saturn return thing, right? It's like at 27, I think it's a lot harder for those habits to go back. That's sort of the difference between if it's like by 25, 27, I think you're growing out of it. But if it continues past that time, you're developing some harder to break habits after that age.
I see. So like when you're in your late 20s, this is like when I look back, what part of it is we're young, we're wild, we're free, and then you kind of grow out of it. And I see what you're saying because around 27, actually, my 25th birthday was the first time I was like, I think maybe I should slow down on my partying. And then it took until my early 30s to really give like sobriety a shot. And then recovery is not a straight line. It goes up and down. It turns around. It's different for everybody. But I don't know. I'm trying to think now why I felt like it was late 30s, early 40s. I feel like I've encountering a lot of people now who I guess maybe tried the it was a wild and crazy 20s, but now I'm good. Now I got it and it's all good.
Mhm.
And this is like the last stop, I feel like, maybe before it's even harder and harder, I guess. I don't know.
I think the longer that train runs, the harder it is to stop it. But I mean, I think what they say with addiction is that we just start to not advance, or it stagnates us, right? Emotionally, spiritually, but that ties into our relationships, our professions. It's like we just reach a point that if we're chasing the party, we're not leaving much room for other things in our life.
Oh my god. I remember one of the first times I like did a few months of sobriety when I was still living in Vancouver, and it was like I don't know, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, I can't remember. And I remember telling a friend, like, I just feel like I can do so much. He's like what? Like, what have you done? And I realized I actually hadn't necessarily done that much, but I felt there was so much more space in my life to consider even doing things. So even the space being available felt like an accomplishment. Um, so yeah, that definitely rings true.
So it's like
Today,
internal space.
internal space, which
Yeah.
when you're like wrapped up in the scene and wrapped up with partying is like there it's so hard to contemplate life without it. Yeah, it's an identity thing, it's a community thing, it's a sex thing. It's like to walk away is not easy for sure.
I think in the gay community, that's definitely the hardest part is finding it difficult to connect with groups of gay men. They're like, how are all these people seem, know each other and look like they're getting along, and then there's like a lot of alcohol
Oh, totally.
involved. I'm not saying that doesn't exist without alcohol, but that's really been my observation and experience. And so being sober, I mean, that's been one of the best benefits. Is that's when I actually started making genuine friendships with gay men, like Trevor, you had mentioned, because I'd always felt
Yeah.
pretty ostracized growing up by men, and then getting into the gay community, it was not it was not a loving brotherhood when I
Mm.
broke out of the scene in Calgary, and yeah, I stumbled along the way, and I didn't really start making those genuine connections until alcohol left the equation. That was my story.
Yeah, totally relate to that. And also the false sense of confidence that you think you have when you're messed up at the club and you're like, I just remember feeling so free at first and it's so exciting. And then the longer that lifestyle goes on, the more artificial that confidence is. And then you stop drinking, you stop doing drugs, and you sort of reintroduce people, those relationships into your life. And you realize very quickly, holy shit, I actually don't know these people at all. I don't have anything in common with them, and they actually don't know me either. And had the same experience with you as the gay community is like, I don't know if I expected a brotherhood, but I at least expected less judgment than the bullies in high school. But in some ways, it's worse because I mean, I don't know why it's worse, but gay men to other gay men, it can just be brutal. Like we're not a big warm hug, are we? We're like,
No, I didn't. Yeah, I feel like I encountered things like jealousy and competition and gossip.
yeah.
Like it was just a lot of really unpleasant things. I remember going to the people I had been introduced to at the club as like a friend group, and it's like, how did how did you go get through coming out? And the answers I got were not helpful.
Mm.
It was pretty shallow, but it could have just also been the environment that I just happened to have been exposed to. But I don't know. That was like 2006 in Calgary, so I mean, there wasn't a lot of options as far as what coming out looked like at that time.
No, definitely not. Oh my God. That was like the year Brittany was going through it too. There was a lot happening in the world, honey. Um, so I wanted to bring you on to talk about psychedelics. And before we dive into this conversation around psychedelics and sobriety, I do want to preface it for anybody listening who is in recovery, whether you're brand new or have been sober a million years. It is something to not just hear one conversation about maybe some success stories or some potential and dive into doing it, because I personally, in my own life, have seen great things happen with psychedelics and sobriety, and I've seen some not so good things happen with psychedelics and sobriety. So I just want to preface that by saying this is just a conversation between two people. It's our experience. Colter, you definitely have exposure to maybe a more structured way of showing
Mm.
psychedelics in your personal life, but yeah, I wanted to preface that before we dive in, because I know when I first was like exploring sobriety and I went to 12-step meetings, one of the first things I asked the person that was sponsoring me was, what if I'm at a party and I meet Lindsay Lohan and Lindsay Lohan wants to do a line with me in the bathroom? My brain was instantly looking for loopholes. Like, even if it's a one chance in a million that I'm going to meet her, I wanted to know that the possibility was open. And I think the same could be for psychedelics. Like, if you're at a meeting, if you're new and you're like, oh my God, I can never drink again, I can never do drugs again. And suddenly there's this new conversation happening around psychedelics. It could be like, oh, maybe my sobriety can include this or that. So I know we've touched
Sure.
a little bit about your sobriety, but I'd love to hear, how psychedelics came into your path, especially when it comes to maintaining sobriety. How do you define your sobriety? How did they come into your path? Give it to me, baby.
It's a long. I think the only way to tell it, I think, is the long way here. But yeah, like I got sober in 2012. I think I started in like 2010, and then I had my last drink in 2012. I'm 37 now, and I really needed the black and white strictness of AA. I think, I'm somebody who's always looked for loopholes as well. So even I remember the first time I tried to get sober, I worked at a bar and I would like taste all the drinks or like have half shots to participate. So, I mean, I always had these sort of, yeah, ways to slip around the program. But then I went out one night and it was just, I did drink. I let myself drink at a pride. And one night oh God, I ended up getting drunk and then finding, other substances to keep awake, which is my what I had always done. And then the next night I went out drinking again and threw up in the cab on the way home. And I was like, Colter, this is this is how drinking always ends for you. There's no, after a year and a half of not drinking and trying it again, it was just the same thing. So sobriety was, that's when I really got strict about it and my life really began to change for the better. That's when I started volunteering for the suicide crisis line. Then I went back to school and everything progressed from that point. And I really owe 12 steps and my sobriety to making those changes. Um, then after the pandemic, things got a little dicey for me. I was ending a 3 year relationship and went into terrible anxiety and depression. I was really experiencing like the physical symptoms of it that I hadn't experienced before. And we know that like the hormonal and the chemical and the interactions and the addiction that we get from relationships and codependency is very much similar to what happens in addiction. And there's a lot of reasons, like previous trauma kind of creates that scene. But yeah, I was feeling really, really unwell. I was doing my practicum at the time. I was doing my practicum at a public health center because that was my goal. I really wanted to take this master's in clinical counseling and work in an environment where I was treating people who had a diagnosis of either depression, mental health, or anxiety, mood disorders, schizophrenia, whatever. I thought, there's really not a lot of us who are trained in being able to provide this treatment, and I want to. That's the community that I want to treat. I'd also, while I was in school, or between my bachelor's and my master's, I was working for an indigenous organization, and I was leading a harm reduction. It was an overdose response coalition. So that's where I really expanded my idea of sobriety that's where I learned in doing that harm reduction work is like, I had to really challenge my beliefs about 12 steps because in the overdose crisis, if someone just goes to abstinence based recovery, they can die. Or that's when I started learning that some of the 12 steps abstinence stuff was really harming people in the way that people were dying because there was so much guilt that if they had a relapse or if they had a slip, that they would be excluded from recovery programming. And what we're dealing in a culture right now with fentanyl, contaminated drugs, I think when the AA literature was written, we weren't talking about things like fentanyl. I mean, these substances just didn't exist. We didn't have things like methadone and Suboxone and treatment programs and understand the severity of like what happens to our addiction pathways with these types of drugs. So it opened my door to like, not everybody has the capacity to go to a treatment program. Some people need clean, uncontaminated drugs to survive. And that kind of, that started to fall outside of the AA 12 step
That's
bounds.
like that is a huge consideration. Like for people who aren't in 12 step, have never had that experience, it can be a fundamentalist group. And for good reason, it has helped millions of people. And the black and white thing is great for telling you, listen, you can't do the loophole thing. This is the lane you need to stay in. And challenging your beliefs around harm reduction must have been hard because it's not a community that wants to hear, from my experience, wants to hear the updated information on addiction and recovery. Like it's very much like, this is what's worked, this is why we do it, this is why you keep coming back, and let's just leave it there. So that must have been hard for you to really challenge that.
Um, I mean, I was just fresh out of my bachelor's in psychology, and so for me, it's more about the research. And I had done research papers and things on the efficacy of AA because that was something I was interested in and exploring. Like, yeah,
Ooh.
why does AA work? And the research that I gathered was like it is extremely accessible. It's
Yep.
free. There's not a
Yep.
hierarchical power structure.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm working with clients and thinking about self care and the ways that we do work with substance use, you could not create a better program than AA.
Mm,
It's got your
mm.
self care. It's got your spirituality. It's got mentorship. It's got a place that you can go to every day of the week
Yep.
to replace. It provides you with community. It's accessible. It's free. Like it is so incredible, and I think it has a great place. And I think I owe my life to it in many ways. And I did need that black and whiteness. But then yeah, when I reached that depression and that anxiety, there was one thing. The one thing that was not serving me well was the idea of, and this might have been my own interpretation of the program, but what I had always done was this idea of amends, of keeping my side of the street clean. You know, I was in this relationship where I was kind of apologizing all the time and just keeping my side of the street clean and just taking everything on myself
Mm.
and you know, and I think I probably created a sense of the relationship that wasn't even real. That maybe if I had have spoken or set some boundaries earlier on and not always apologized, I think we could have had a maybe more egalitarian relationship. But that's sort of the message that I got from AA. So it was just like, oh, I just have to adapt. I just have to pray, go to more meetings, and then I try to adapt to the situation. And then I, out of desperation, went on antidepressants, and because that's sort of an acceptable medication in AA. It really depends on who you talk to. So there's people divided on that, but you know, I was working with clients in the public health system who were all on antidepressants and medications, and I was like, well, this is kind of, I guess, what you do. So I did
Mm-hmm.
go on. I did go on the antidepressants. I went for about 6 weeks. They were very helpful in being functional,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, not helpful necessarily in connecting to my heart or what I consider to be kind of like my spiritual presence, which I'd gotten learned about in AA. But I just felt like there was a fog or a veil that was disconnecting me from life, and so I stopped taking them. I'd lost my motivation on them. And then when I stopped taking them, yeah, some anxiety came back, but I also was myself again.
Mm.
Um, but still, I wasn't right. I was having just a lot of rumination and just feeling quite fractured, not being able to make any appropriate decision. It was really like a depressive episode. And out of desperation again, I tried psychedelics. I tried microdosing. My ex had taken me to the store, and because he wasn't programmed, and uh, I tried them, and I was really scared that I was really scared that I was breaking my sobriety, and that this is something that I would have to come clean to my sponsor about, and what would happen. But I took 100 milligrams, little capsule. I took some pre workout. I went to the
Of
gym
mushrooms?
of mushrooms, yeah,
Yeah.
and my mind cleared. I felt so much gratitude and hope again about my situation. I was able to kind of like forgive myself, forgive my ex, look at the relationship from a different lens, and I was just, and then once I had that relief of happiness, the ball started rolling back in the other way, where I was just,
Mm.
it was just such a relief to not be depressed like I had been for 4 months, that I was able to like click out of that, and that microdose um, sort of opened the door, and then I started doing it a little bit more regularly, and I came out of that depression. And then just randomly, I found this clinic. I was actually seeing a therapist here for just personal reasons, and then I found out that they did the psychedelic integration, and the therapist I was working with was like, maybe you should contact the director here. And I was also doing, my other practicum site was in group trauma therapy. It's the kind that they specialize doing with veterans who are returning from
Wow.
um, who are traumatized and are recovering from deployment. And so I was doing that work as well. And the director there also referred me to this clinic, because a lot of the men who set up Thrive were doing this work with veterans and trauma work. So they just happened to move
Wow.
into the psychedelic integration as well. And the stars just all lined up. And now I'm doing work which is much more authentic to my experience. I really wanted to do public health. I really believed in it, but it's just not, authentic and integral. And one thing I would just, before I forget, the 12 steps, like it is weird because you've got these permissions to use doctor prescribed medications like clonazepam, Ativan, antidepressants. I see psychedelics as an alternative to
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So that's where I justify it, and that's where it makes sense. The big distinction for me is, I think this is really important, is that there's that drugs are street drugs, party drugs, and a lot of prescriptions. They give you this immediate relief. You know, if we take an Ativan that's prescribed, it's going to ease our anxiety, but we are going to have a withdrawal, and the anxiety is going to come back because we haven't dealt with the root issue. Same with drinking Coke, whatever we're taking, immediate relief followed by an after effect, a withdrawal. Psychedelics are completely opposite, where you take, if you think that you're going to party or numb out on a psychedelic, you're going to get really front loaded or confronted with emotions. So that's the thing, is with the psychedelics, we're being front loaded with anxiety, discomfort. We're facing the emotions we've been avoiding. So if you're in addiction, if you just take a handful of mushrooms, you're going to have a bad time. I did. I hated mushrooms when I was in addiction. I couldn't understand why anybody took them. But then I find it makes you confront whatever you've been avoiding. And then you get this relief or aha moment or release, and you get to keep that. Um, so that's where I see them as being opposite, where, you know, other substances that are addictive, we have immediate relief and then a
Yeah.
withdrawal. Psychedelics, we have the discomfort up front and then we have the relief after.
That is so true. That is so true. I often feel like when I was growing up, I loved smoking pot, and I was like, I loved the feeling. It was so good. And then when I moved into the club scene and started doing chemical drugs, I couldn't do pot anymore. Like I couldn't do pot. I know people laugh when I say that. I couldn't. It had a very different effect. And when we started exploring microdosing, I was so scared because I did not want that experience. I did ayahuasca. Yeah, it was like a lot of anxiety and stuff like that. But it's such a good way that you articulated that is party drugs, alcohol. It's an instant relief followed by anxiety. And psychedelics is not like, even if you're trying to do them in a social setting, like I'm going to go dancing, I'm going to take mushrooms. It doesn't guarantee that just because you're in a social setting, you're going to have that fun, loose experience. Like
You can't control
oftentimes,
it. They control,
yeah.
they give you what you need.
Yeah, it's an unpredictable experience. Whereas like drinking, drugs, whatever your drug is, tend to be very predictable. I know if I do this amount, I'm going to get this experience. And that's, I guess, what is so appealing about them,
We're
right?
in our will. We're trying to control, we're trying to avoid an emotion. Like I remember going out partying and being like, oh, I got a little bit of a cold. I've worked like 12 hours. So I'm going to drink this much more and snort this much more so that I can not feel this. Yeah.
No,
So
thank
we're
you.
all those, and those are all the, and those can be behaviors too. It can be substances or behaviors that we're doing to avoid our emotions, avoid what our body is telling us. And I find psychedelics has been helpful in me learning what my emotions are, helping me use my emotions as a compass for my self care. When I microdose, things that feel good to me feel really good. The music I listen to sounds incredible. If a country song comes on, I'm pissed. You know, it's when something happens that I don't like on mushrooms, I'm really miserable. So it's helped me kind of it helps me calibrate to knowing myself, what feels good for me, stretching, healing my body, how good that feels when I microdose, and just listening to what my body is trying to tell me.
So you mentioned the first time you did the first microdose pill, you got like an instant moment of like, holy shit, this is what I need to do. When was that?
That was in like July 2000, 2 years ago,
2 years ago? Okay.
2021. Yeah.
Um, Crazy that you had that instant, immediate, like effect of helping you get that clarity, and it makes sense that you would follow this path. I mean, the obvious question that people are probably wanting to know is like, we talked about loopholes, we talked about that at the beginning, and the way you describe it is makes perfect sense. It's confronting your emotions, it's healing, you're microdosing, you're not macrodosing. It's not like a party thing, but it's a mind altering substance. So I think you've done a good job of articulating up until now where psychedelics
Mhm.
fall for you personally. But there has to be a line for people who struggle with addiction when it comes to these things. Like, is it
Yeah.
something that everybody can do? Like, have you seen compulsive behaviors emerge because of this?
Good question. I would say, and when I'm working with clients, so at Thrive, the thing is that psychedelics are not legal, nor are they decriminalized, but we have dispensaries. People can buy them without consequence. We also have, therapeutic research on the benefits of psychedelics. So what we're doing is if people are choosing to use psychedelics as for therapeutic reasons, we have the experience and are following the best practices to help inform people. And just like, so for example, antidepressants have a good, you know, good out, I think 20-50% outcome on their own. Therapy, same. You add antidepressants and therapy together, you get 80% better
Hmm.
outcomes. Psychedelics, same thing as how I would see it. Is like psychedelics on their own, good. Therapy on its own, good. Combine the two together,
Yeah.
you're going to get much better experiences out of it. So, is it for everybody? Um, when I'm working with clients and addiction, I consider it to be quite a high barrier intervention. High barrier meaning I wouldn't recommend it until you've already done therapy, you've maybe done some
Mm.
step work, you've done some introspection. It's kind of like an analogy I would use is like you're not going to take steroids when you first start going to the gym. If you've worked out a bunch and you're at a plateau, then you might add something
You
to
need
it.
you need you need a foundation.
You
You
need a
need to like,
foundation.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So you want to
That's
take, yeah.
I love that analogy. It's such a gay guy thing. Like steroids for my straight listeners. They're like, what does he mean by that? It means
Yeah,
basically like if you start taking steroids today, you're not just going to get muscles. You need to be
right.
able to have a routine. It has to be part of your lifestyle. You need to have a
Yeah.
good diet, and then once you've changed your body, it's part of your lifestyle. You want to go that step further. The same with psychedelics. Like if you go in from active addiction straight to psychedelics, it's going to be probably messy and not. You may get some insight. You may get some aha moments. Those lightning rods of clarity, but the chances of it having a long-term effect and being able to integrate would be lower because you don't have the tools to understand what it means.
It's like, so this is best practices, safest ways. This is what I would recommend the people that I'm working with. I mean, but honestly, a microdose of 100, 200 milligrams in that small amount, if you want to use that as part of your recovery program, I don't think that, first of all, the side effects for psychedelics are very minimal. The biggest, the, the biggest concerns would be if somebody has a history of themselves or family member having bipolar or schizophrenia. There is a risk that I have seen with people that using psychedelics can trigger a manic or schizophrenic episode. Okay, so that's a really big consideration. You see a lot of people in addiction might have had psychotic breaks or things like that. So we want to be cautious there. Um, my sense when I've talked to people who have schizophrenia in their family, if you want to take a spiritual lens, from people I've talked to personally, I get the sense that some of us already have that door to that world open. And so if we're looking at schizophrenia not from like a mental health diagnosis lens, but more from like, okay, what's going on spiritually with this person that maybe they're open or they're more sensitive to energy or whatever it is, that then maybe they don't need psychedelics, but they can tap into that side of themselves with breath work, meditation, or other practices.
This is an interesting point. I had somebody on my show years ago. He worked at CAMH in Toronto, Center for Addiction and Mental Health. And he had done an article for CBC about the difference between a spiritual awakening and a psychotic break, essentially. And he said it's really interesting because a lot of people ride that line. There are people who are in psychosis who think that they're talking to God, and it's not. And that's a sign of, danger zone. You need to get yourself help or grounded or whatever you need to do. But there are people who are truly having a spiritual moment, but is also maybe showing signs of like, is this real? Is it not? So it's interesting that you say that because I know people listening will be like, well, schizophrenia is a disease. You can't look at it spiritually. That would be irresponsible, right? Like approaching something like that spiritually is leading that person to danger. I hear what you're saying though, is like, is there something more to it that maybe we can consider to round out the way that we're helping these people who are experiencing reality in a very, very different way? Why not approach it spiritually, right?
In my work, I work very much in like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is evidence based. It's the most like cognitive research, clinical, pretty practice of counseling that you can do. And then working with psychedelics, I'm also on this very like mystical, spiritual side because psychedelics do, yeah, the clinical term is mystical experience or awe experiences of connectedness. So that's how we classify
Love
it.
it.
So you're working with this sort of spiritual, mystical element and clinical evidence based approach, and I find for me where I get the most inspired is where I see these two things overlap. So whether it's
Mm.
looking at research or looking at like clinical just behavior, consequences, results, and then listening to somebody like Abraham Hicks talk about the law of attraction, I can see how these two are not incompatible with each other.
Mm-hmm,
It
mm-hmm,
just like
mm-hmm,
12
mm-hmm.
steps has this spiritual approach, but like I said, you couldn't create a better like um, behavioral plan for just showing up and socializing with a bunch of people at these very accessible meetings. Both overlap very well.
I think too with anything like AA too. I remember one of my beefs was, and still something I struggle with, is somebody's getting arrested near you. The police are coming to take Colter away as we speak live on the Superficial Spirit. Um, Sirens. Okay, they're past. Um, One thing I was thinking about as you were explaining that, because I've talked a lot about Abraham Hicks on my show, a lot about sobriety, a lot about 12 steps, and what I always come back to is you can go into these spaces and not agree with everything 100%. And you can take what works for you and you can leave the rest. Like, I remember my big beef with AA is like, why do I have to every single damn day of my life raise my hand and say I'm an alcoholic when I've been sober for a year, when I've been sober for 2 years, when I've been sober for 2.5 years, which is my longest? I really had a problem with that. And then, by doing the steps, one, two, and three, you have your spiritual awakening, or you start that journey of seeking out your higher power. I realized if that's the only problem that I have and everything else is working, then why don't I just do it and not think about it
Mm.
and take what works for me? And it was great. Like I relate to what you said about how like the steps changed my life. They took me in a new direction. I learned so many new things about myself. I got a new career. Like I became there's. I mean, I could talk for a long time about all the benefits of it. It really is a great program for that. And same with manifesting. There's so many examples of bullshit manifestors, these stupid life coaches and these like crazy psychics who are telling you how to manifest money, but they can't pay their rent. But if you can read these books and there is something about that rings true to you, that there is maybe something about the universe that we can connect to that helps shape our future, then take that and just do whatever you want with it. It doesn't have to be Abraham Hicks. It doesn't have to be Oprah or Deepak or anybody. What's his name? Who wrote A New Earth? What's his name? Eckhart Tolle. But you can take what you like, and same with psychedelics. Maybe it's not something you do all the time, but you can have a little bit of that magic and incorporate it into your life. And I think where people get maybe hurt or disillusioned is by putting all of their eggs in a basket and thinking that this one thing is going to solve my problems. I just manifest perfectly. I'm going to become a star. If I can do enough psychedelic drugs, I'm never going to have any anxiety or negative thoughts. If I can, be the best AA person in the world and stay sober forever, I'll never have any problems. that's not realistic. There is no one solution for everything, unless you consider God, which I personally do, and like the idea of surrender, which I have found is constantly the one thing that can always save me. But yeah, that's what I was thinking about when I was listening to you. Is like you can incorporate all these things, and maybe putting everything in one basket is can be maybe a little risky.
It's interesting. Yeah, the surrender, like psychedelics, very much help us if, with nothing else but surrendering to the experience. If we have resistance to the experience, we're going to have a bad time. Where it really teaches you to surrender to your emotion, to surrender to whatever is blocking you there, surrender to what your body is telling you. Um, yeah, psychedelics bring us so much into the moment. I find I'm really present with it. One thing I found about 12 steps or just self help culture in general is like you're always working towards the next version of yourself.
Mhm.
Like you were saying, like, if I do this, I'll be this. If you do this, I'll be
Yeah.
this. The law of attraction doesn't say that. The law of attraction
No.
says, believe it, you already have it.
Yeah.
And with the psychedelics, I feel like on something like a microdose, I'm already in it. I'm totally experiencing what it's like to be in the moment. And it's, as you say, like there's all these different teachers, Deepak and Eckhart, like, but they all practice
Yeah.
being in the moment. There's so much where this
Yes.
all overlaps.
Yeah, totally in the moment. And I remember like manifesting. When I first heard about the concept, I was like, "Oh my God, this is what I've been doing my whole life. It totally makes sense." But then I was too aware of my thoughts that I would like spiral. I was like, "What am I thinking about? Oh my God, is that good or is it bad?" And now it's like, I put my intention out. I know the things that I want, and then I let it go, and I meditate, and I surrender, and I'm. It's a constant like dance and engagement with God or with the universe, and I think psychedelics would be the same. I'm curious to know what you think about doing psychedelics in a clinical setting or with a guide or a shaman versus somebody going out on Friday night and deciding to do MDMA to connect to their higher self, or doing some mushrooms on the weekend to have a healing experience. Like, is there a difference between doing them socially and on your own versus doing them with
Yeah,
somebody like you?
yeah, huge. Because I have done, you know, ceremonies and psychedelic journeys, which is different than integration work. I mean, integration work with a therapist is like debriefing, preparing, supporting the client on their psychedelic journey versus like doing a journey or a ceremony.
Hmm.
So when I'm doing that, when I'm doing ceremonies or journeys, what was the sorry, what was the question?
Just, is there a difference between doing
Oh
it
yeah,
socially or doing it, yeah, with a
yeah. So when you're doing it intentionally and you're doing it therapeutically, and you're taking a certain amount and you've set an attention, the psychedelic is going to listen to you again. Whether this is some like mystic magic mushroom or it's working with the opening up the unconscious of your brain chemistry, again, I think both these things can be compatible.
Mhm.
It's listening to what you want, and then you're working through it. So if the intention is I want to take a little bit, or I want to take some socially and have a good time, then you're going to be with friends. You're going to be distracted. You're having an outer experience um, that's involves visuals and being social. But when you're doing it therapeutically, we recommend like eyes closed, blindfold, headphones is what the John Hopkins studies have done.
What?
And so people are going through this inward journey. So without the stimulation of like the lights and people, you're looking at your intention internally, what's going on all in here. So that can be a very, very different
Whoa.
experience.
I had no idea that that's what it was. I
Mm-hmm.
had, holy shit. Okay. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
definitely have never done that. Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Wow. I want to try that now. Um, Totally different experience. What do
Yes.
you, I want to talk now a little bit about So wait, just to like round out that conversation.
Sure.
Socially, what you're saying is like chances are if you're doing a psychedelic socially or on your own because you're curious, there is potential for healing because it works with where you're at mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And there's no reason why you can't have a profound experience.
It depends what
Clinically, it's
your
more guided.
it's more your intention and the setting. And again, I mean, I think that that's the value of working with a therapist who has experiences that we can talk about. Maybe somebody does want to do microdosing, or they want to use it socially, or they want to use it therapeutically. Then, yeah, talking to somebody, it doesn't have to be a therapist. Even other people who have experience or who do this work as a practice
Hmm.
can be helpful to set intentions. And I
Yeah.
think if you go to like other, again, from a spiritual practice, these are sacraments, and maybe all substances really can be sacraments that we
Hmm.
respect and use intentionally. And there was times, I think the best
Ooh.
nights that I had drinking were nights that our friend Alex Barbie, that
Yeah.
we drank a lot together. And sometime there was nights where we did set intentions at the beginning of like, okay, how much are we going to drink, and what do we want to have happen tonight, and what do we want to manifest from this evening? And those nights would generally be better.
This is a really interesting segue. I used to do this with a friend. Okay, two things. One, Evan used to see somebody named Odin the Seer. He's a witch. He lives in Ireland now. Um, and he used to say, like, this is when I was like Club Kid Central, and he was like, there is nothing innately wrong with alcohol and drugs. It's what you're using them for, right? And if you find power and magic and inspiration in going out and doing it, and it truly is giving you a fulfilling experience, then who's to say don't do it, right? The danger zone is like having absolute clarity on that. So that's one thing. It was a really interesting topic at that point to consider. Like, okay, like nightlife was for so long such a magical place for me because I felt like it was the incubator for my dreams and it was where everything
Mm-hmm.
was going to happen, and alcohol and drugs were a part of that, right? So I didn't see anything bad with it for a very very long time. So that's one thing interesting for anybody to consider, like, are you using it in this sacrament kind of way? Are you engaging in it, or is it problematic? That's one thing. The second is my friend Jordy and I used to pray to Dionysus, who is the god of partying, when we
Yes.
had no money. And we would go to the club and we were like, please get us fucked up, like get us drinks, get us drugs, get us boys. And every time, man, I got home at 7 in the morning and I was like, holy shit, that was a night. So yeah, you can like, there's so much I guess there's a lot of when you think about spirituality and you think of like your higher self, a lot of people think of like good things like health, wellness, sunshine, light, health, like all of these things. But there is dark power to that as well. Like you can use all of that energy and channel it into whatever you want. I think it's an interesting thing.
I think, yeah, accepting and making friends with some of the darkness that we have within ourselves, yeah, and not judging it. We're all capable of good and bad. And I think
Yeah,
that once we get to know sort of our shadowy self, which like Carl Jung would say is, I think then we have more compassion for ourselves, and we also have more compassion for the shadows of other people. And
totally.
I've learned a little bit of that through psychedelics as well, as actually getting really comfortable. Like an example would be, I used to go to, this is sort of a gay thing, but you know how gay people are really good in customer service. I was a
Yeah.
bartender. You see. I always think of in White Lotus, the guy who works at the hotel. He's got this like
Yes.
people pleasing, like they're
Yeah. Yeah.
so good
Yeah.
at putting the mask on, and then he retreats into his office for all the darkness.
Yeah.
And I thought that was just such a good example of like what we experience as gay men, is like having that acceptable, likable, non-threatening, happy part of us, but then dealing with the mask underneath. And I think that that's why a lot of us go to drinking, is because being ourselves is really difficult, and it's a lot easier to have the face on with alcohol. But with psychedelics, I found, or just in my own practice, I've gotten to really accept that I don't have to wear that face anymore. I can be
Mm.
authentic. I can show up, and I'm allowed to be a little bit cunty if I want. I don't have to be rude. But I'm allowed to have my emotions. And I remember, I think, the last Pride I went to, or the year before, I remember I would see if guys weren't like happy and bubbly or kind of had like that stiff face, I would be like, what's their problem? Why don't they like me? And then I was like,
Mm.
oh, they're fine. That's
Yeah.
you feeling like everybody owes you a smile. Like you're allowed to be whatever you want to be, and so are
Yeah.
they. And there
Yeah.
you don't have to be offended. And now when I see people who look a little bit cunty, I feel like, good for you.
Yeah. Oh my God. I was just talking to Derek about this on my last episode. Like, like that has nothing to do with you,
Yeah.
bitch. Like, if you're walking into a room thinking everyone's judging you, you need to go to a therapist, not a different party. Damn.
And
Yeah.
there is so much judgment of, gays do that to each other, of like, oh, who do they think they are, or they've got this, I don't know, face on. But it's like, no,
Oh fuck.
they're allowed to be. We're all, and you are too. You're allowed to not always
Yes.
have the fake smile and laugh.
People always thought I was so full of myself all the time, because I was just so self obsessed. But it was a creative thing. Like I was trying to be a star and I was very focused on myself. And then they would talk to me and they'd be like, oh my God, you're so much nicer than I thought. And again, it's like assuming that somebody who is out there and doing their thing is just like selfish and has no feelings and is egotistical is not necessarily true. Mind you, to become a star, you do have to have some ego. But yeah, I think it's a good point just to remind yourself that the way somebody looks and their expression on their face probably has nothing to do with you unless you're doing something directly to them to aggravate.
Yeah, the
um
stories that we make up in our head, like that's all our self reflection of how other people make us feel.
I want to talk about MDMA because you know what, this is like this I feel like psychedelics are psychedelics and like party drugs are party drugs, and I think that MDMA is in the middle. And I
Totally.
feel like out of all the psychedelics, the one that has the highest potential to open the door to take you back to other drugs would be MDMA for a lot of reasons. One, it's chemical. Two, it's used in nightclubs and party settings. It's used for sex and intimacy, especially by gay men. Um, and I when I hear about people using psychedelics, that's the one thing that I'm like, "Meh, I don't know about that. I don't know, honey, if like going dancing and doing MDMA is a healing experience. I know that it feels that way, but is it opening the door for other things? So I'm curious what your thoughts are. Where does MDMA sit for you in the realm of psychedelics having healing potential?
Yeah, I mean, I have experienced it. Um, I've experienced it therapeutically, and I've experienced it recreationally. Um, it's I mean, I was just having this conversation um, with staff here of like what are thoughts on that. Where it's funny because I do see it as being it's having that immediate gratification or that immediate relief,
Yeah.
and then it has it does have a hangover which you need to
Hmm.
recover from. Sometimes, I have heard and I have experience too using it in a therapeutically intentional way, and using like a a certain amount and then going home and sleeping and taking care of yourself and then not having really a hangover.
Mm.
But if you're using it in like a party recreational way, um, it can go it can go the other way pretty quickly, I think. So again, it's about intention. I think psychedelically, I in my practice, I find when I'm taking larger amounts of mushrooms or a psychedelic substance, it takes me to this. This is my personal experience. It takes me to sort of like this different dimensional place. And I know what that place is like. I'm just floating completely in the present. I've shifted over into that other, into my psychedelic self. Um, MDMA does not take me to that
Mm.
place, but I think it does have some therapeutic. Ketamine is another one that they're using therapeutically. Yeah.
Yes.
So they're like, they're borderline. I think that each person is allowed to have their own personal relationship with each substance.
Yeah,
That's kind
that's a
of
good
what
point.
I would take away from myself. And I've kind of learned what my individual, like I will never, I don't plan on drinking ever again. I know my relationship with that substance. It's not serving me anything for me. Um, but there are substances that, yeah, that I would say I have a different relationship with.
I'm still waiting for them to find the healing properties of cocaine in Hollywood, honey, in the Hollywood Hills.
I don't know if it was ever used to.
I think for like teeth numbing for babies, I think.
It
But then
was.
they have Adderall, which I'm sorry, ain't that different than doing a huge fat line. Sorry, trigger warning. Oh,
I consider cocaine to be maybe a bit low vibrational. Sort of
oh fuck
how
yeah.
I would.
It's primal. It's like yeah, yeah,
Mm.
totally. That was just a joke. I don't think there's any healing. Although I mean, let's see. I mean, I think there can be experience as open you up and maybe whatever. Sure, any drug can provide an experience that may be helpful in some ways. Yes.
Not meth. I don't think it would.
Yeah.
I don't think it falls into that
See,
kind
this
of.
is yeah, this is why like going back to what we were talking about earlier is like is having something be a sacrament and being sacred and magical is like
Mm.
the danger with saying something like that and is like somebody could be listening and being like, well, for me meth is XYZ, for me heroin is XYZ. And that's why these conversations are so you have to be so careful and it's not your responsibility
Yeah,
and it's not my responsibility to make those decisions, but as a podcaster we have to put that asterisk of like
sure.
this is just two people talking, this is not life advice, and if you are going to do it you need to really think about it because
Well,
yeah.
as a therapist, harm reduction would have like there's sort of that movement that, especially with the overdose crisis, is like people have the autonomy of their own use and what that looks like for them, and that we want to also be moving away from this substance judgment place where like
Yes,
if you
totally.
like you said, if you're a celebrity using cocaine, like that's acceptable, but if you're um, not if you don't have housing and you're on the street and using an opioid, then that's a problematic. But
Yeah.
if you're using heroin versus using painkillers, depending on your socioeconomic status, there's a different stigma around that too. When both might be recovering from a back injury.
Exactly. It's so fucking crazy. I love this conversation. There's so the drug story and the way that society reacts to them says a lot about who we are and what we value and what we deem as appropriate or inappropriate.
We're all doing. We all have a relationship with substances. I mean, maybe some subsects of people avoid caffeine and everything together, but for the most part, I mean, we're all using either substances that are stigmatized or not stigmatized, and then it depends on the setting and the person. And
Hmm.
it's quite common. Going back to AA, I mean, I really, that was it was created in a time where a lot of the substances today weren't used or discovered. And you also had, was it Bill or Bob, who
Bill.
thought
Oh,
thought
I don't
that
know.
psychedelics should be. He used psychedelics and he was
Yeah, he
kicked out of the
did.
program, but he thought that used as a spiritual intention, that would be the next part of the recovery. And that doesn't
Yeah.
get talked about too much, but how interesting would that have been if another chapter of AA had have developed in that direction?
Oh God, there's so many things that could benefit from like re-evaluating some of this stuff. Like we also didn't have language for a lot of the mental struggles that people have and
Yeah.
mood disorders and sexuality. Like everything in the book is also like a man and his wife, a man and his wife. It's like very heteronormative. I know there's meetings that are queer focused and they can, adjust, but yeah, things are changing so quickly. And I'm so curious where the psychedelic is this whole commercialization, accessibility, like it's happening quickly. I'm so glad that you came on to chat about it. I want to come do something with you. I need to do the blindfold thing. Put on the blindfold, put on the earplugs, and see what happens. That's a little nerve wracking. Oh
Yeah, so
God.
I guess in the last couple of minutes, for people who want to start again, I would say, if you wouldn't want to have a practice of self care or self exploration, which looks like therapy, reading, journaling, podcast, whatever you're doing to already be kind of on that journey of taking care of yourself. And then maybe what I would start with is you can get capsules of like 100 milligrams, 200 milligrams, starting low. On the internet, you'll see lots of different protocols for like how and when. I tell
Mm.
people maybe try starting with a small amount, a couple days a week, leave some space in your calendar that day, take it, and then just do what feels good and expect that maybe a little bit of discomfort or restlessness is going to be a part of that experience. But I think it's more important that just we as the individual develop the relationship with it. And then when we get comfortable at 100, maybe take a little bit higher, see how that feels in your body. And go from there with the microdosing a couple days a week. We don't want to take it every day because we'll build a tolerance. So you want to give it a little bit of space in between, whether it's a day or 2 days. I take it twice a week. Um, I do maybe like yoga. I love doing yoga. I love moving
Mm.
my body on it. I also like going to the gym and listening to like really hard style dance music. And that just puts me in my happy place. But if that's not your happy place, it's probably do what makes you'll do what you enjoy with a microdose and sort of develop that relationship with yourself. If you're wanting to do a higher dose, no more, and after you've gotten comfortable with the microdosing, I would say no more than a gram by yourself. And if you're wanting to do a gram and you're wanting to have that sort of therapeutic journey experience, you definitely want to have someone sit with you. I would be happy to sit with you, Peter.
Okay.
And you want to preferably somebody sit for you who has had that experience themselves. So I'm only going to work or support with clients on things that I have personally done myself. So same thing here, just like sponsorship. Somebody who's already walked through the process to be able to guide you through that. With the intention, but no more than a gram, I would say, unless you've got somebody else who's experienced with you.
I was going to ask what your advice was for anybody listening, but you just gave it. I think this is great. I'll post your if you're comfortable, your Instagram
Totally.
or
Yeah.
whatever, so people can reach out to you if they have questions. This is a topic we'll continue to explore on the show because I'm super curious about it. I want to hear the good, the bad, the ugly, because everything is dual. Not everything is everything. Everything is everything. Everything is everything. You can quote me on that. Thank you for being here, Colter. Thank you for sharing your experience. And we will be doing mushrooms together very soon. Maybe I'll do it
Okay.
live on the podcast.
All right.
Maybe not. Okay, I'll
The
stop
second
there.
time.